that's what it really matters, and that's what you should take away kind of from some of these big announcements and everything, because like I said before, like shiny object syndrome and seeing a game, let's say it's a new shooter that's coming out, and you're like, hey, this is exactly kind of the way I want to approach it. It's like, maybe not necessarily, because they have the budget and means to go a little bit above that, and if you and that's why they're casting that wide net, because they want to get that data collection and then narrow it down. But you guys have to be a little bit more mindful of, okay, who is my audience? Who do I target? How do I target them and stuff? And not letting these big announcement type stuff kind of distract you a little bit from that type of focus. Now, Mustapha, what else is out there though too? You talked about like just overall like big announcements and things from new games and how they differ from indies as a whole, but like what other things in terms of like really big game changers in the industry that might like sidetrack us a little bit, and we might be a little as a whole not necessarily focused or I'd say as a whole worried about potential change, because some of these things that are coming out seem like they're very big. They're going to have a really big impact on the industry, and we don't know how to necessarily react to them right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd be kind of remiss if I didn't mention at least Google Stadia and the potential impact that could have, as kind of adapting to this sort of streaming approach to games. I myself am always a little reluctant when I hear the future of gaming on an E3 stage. It's pretty commonplace these days.
Yeah.
Do you think that this one is a big deal? So, that's definitely on my radar. I believe, with the announcement of Project Scarlet, the Xbox, whatever it's going to be, I kind of have returned to some of the concerns that I had a few years prior with the One X and the One S, and that is if you continue to make the home console market so modular that we're doing these sort of iterative versions of the same consoles every couple of years, at that point, what differentiates consoles from PC starts to go away. And I think that Stadia has this sort of hidden advantage of being immune to that because of the fact that it's all kind of cloud-based and network-focused. So that, I think, is where a lot of the future of games is going to go, is we're going to continue to see this question of, is it really viable to continue building on things hardware-wise when we're not going to be able to keep it at reasonable price points the higher we go, as well as, is it easier to do something that people can all have access to through sort of one system, one space, as opposed to these kind of, different houses for all of the different gaming experiences that we want to have.
Yeah, and that puts – it's funny because as you were saying that, I was thinking like, all right, if we were to ask everybody right now one question, which would be, would you rather make a game for one console or numerous consoles? Like, what would the answer be? And I would just thinking, I'm not speaking on behalf of the listeners here, but in general, I would be simply like, well, logistically, objectively, and everything else, I would say I would rather just do one one version of the game than 20, or having to worry about, hey, who do I hire to port this? Do I need a publisher now to do this and everything else? So we can obviously see the huge upset that this is going to have in the industry, but maybe as crazy as it sounds, maybe for a positive outlook too. Not that I'm trying to say like I'd love to give all the extra emphasis or support for Google, because I don't necessarily agree with that either. But it's just it is kind of weird. But there's definitely some benefits to it. But then there's some like hard stuff to kind of adapt to as well.
Sure.
There's I can't think of it right now, but there was another point I wanted to make too, in all of that, which if it comes back to me, we'll talk about it. But yeah, I mean, it's like you were saying, it's a big thing that's happening, and it's something that people should probably, really consider in terms of not just like Google or Project Scarlet and all these other things that could potentially be happening, but like what does that look like for your bottom line and everything else? Because and bottom line, not just being game sales. Yes, that's a big important part of it, but bottom line being like, how are you getting your name out there? How are you getting your game out there? And how are you going to be interacting with people? Because I remember what I was going to talk about. But like that bottom line was just it's just really important to think about, because the way I see at least this change, and Mustapha, please chime in to see if you think I'm in line here, is it really comes down to behavior, right? And if a lot of people, a lot of players out there are behaving a certain way, and I bet you of all people or entities out there that are picking up on the behavior aspect, it's going to be Google. So they're kind of like already connecting the dots for us. And for behavior in terms of how people consume content and things like that, and even from outside of a behavior of people who are, let's say myself, I know you too, Mustapha, and others that are like, hey, when I play a game, I play it on my PS4 or I play it on my Nintendo Switch. That behavior is already set, kind of like almost like in our blood, instinctually, to do it that way. But we also have behaviors in which we're fully connected to just about everything else because of entities like Google, right? Mm-hmm. So once that behavior is introduced, it really comes down to, and I'm getting pretty like detailed here, but it really comes down to like how easy is it for people to adapt to that particular behavior. And honestly, with something like Stadia, I would say that would be pretty an easy transition because we're already essentially doing that already. So
yeah, I mean, if there's anybody, like, I think you make a great point here. Okay, Google is not going out on a limb. They're not taking a big risk here. They're acting with the confidence of knowing and understanding those behaviors, and also knowing the trust that we as people in general have in Google. I mean, they own most of the things we interact with, so I'd say that they're pretty cognizant of that. So I'm not worried about Stadia. I think it's absolutely going to find its home in this industry. My concern is really more with the other companies, and it's that if we don't find a way to continue to differentiate ourselves in way of powerful, accessible technology, then something like Stadia does have the potential to kind of cannibalize a lot of these other platforms. Because accessibility for developers and accessibility for players are the most important thing. And if you're constantly shifting your hardware to jump on every new trend, you kind of lose the ability for people to find it accessible.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right there. So that's really the tough part there, too, in terms of adaptation, early adapters, and things like that. And it's not just from the dev perspective, but it's also the player and the demand perspective, and how is that going to take. Now, on a side note, and I don't mean to necessarily bring this up for anybody who's it's hard for, but when it talks about behaviors, that's also essentially the main decisions that were made behind EA's Battlefront with the loot boxes and stuff. They
Sure.
took analytical data and all this other and previous data, and they were like, hey, look, the way people behave is like this, so we're going to put in this model too. And it completely flopped, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
you can buy Battlefront like next to nothing now because of that, and the just everything that happened from that. But my point with making that statement is simply this: even though behavior is a very, 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 very strong factor, and one that people should always consider whenever you're doing your marketing and things like that, because at the soul and the essence, behavior is the basic thing. And if a behavior or a habit, I should say, is very easy to adapt, or you make it very accessible and just make it something that it could be, that transition to that particular behavior is easy, that's great. But in some cases, such as the one I just outlined with Battlefront, it might not be the case. So even though I would say that Google's probably onto something, and Microsoft as well, and we can kind of see these things heading to a streaming platform, in terms of where it stands within the next year or so is probably anybody's guess, because just because there's all this data and everything else that backs that behavior, we don't necessarily know. So I don't know. It will be really interesting to see how this plays out. But I think at least with a 5-year time span, it's going to be kind of inevitable, and we're going to see a lot of changes happening. But in light of that that perspective or outlook, I think what we're really trying to say in all of this is just be prepared to make some changes, because at the end of the day, you guys still need to get your game out there and get people playing it. And if we're not doing those things and being mindful of those things, then it's going to be really difficult to succeed and get where you want to be at in the near future. Any other comments to that, Mustapha, or just final thoughts?
No, I think I'm on the same page with you. I think we're definitely, and it's always fun. It's always exciting. I mean, when it comes to the indies, of course, you always want to see it succeed no matter what, because that, it's kind of the small man. There's jobs and families and things like that, very important things on the line. But when it comes to these kind of bigger companies that can afford to take these types of risks, it's essential. It's integral to the growth of the industry. So kind of seeing how, the next 2 years pans out for both of these companies, I think is really going to, kind of bring to light where the actual future of gaming is headed.
Yeah, totally. All right, so I think that pretty much concludes what we were really looking to talk about today. So kind of to wrap things up, some key points I'd make. If you're going, so in terms of going to these events, whatever events you're planning on going to, a few things, know the tone of the event, know who the audience it's catering to, and everything else, and how it's going to benefit you. So gauge at an event and interpret the tone, as Mustapha said. Also, go in with a mission, make up a plan, come in and know what kind of panels you want to see in advance and everything. If they provide that information, usually they do. And also know what questions you're going to ask to different types of people, whether it's other devs that you're networking with, panelists, potential partnerships. Have those questions ready to know to ask so you can make the most out of those events. From an exhibitor perspective, I mean, just keep that energy going. I mean, and stand out. That's really the main point of it. There's other things you could do with your booth and everything else, but the main thing is make sure you're doing everything possible to match that energy for people coming in, and just keep that going on. Mustapha made some great points about seeing if you can hire extra people there, even if they're not that familiar with their game. Make sure they're familiar enough so that way everybody has enough energy to last throughout the game. And then from another perspective, if you're not attending those events, you're not an exhibitor, but you kind of just follow them, I mean, try not to get sidetracked by the the big shiny object stuff, but really hone in on what's the stuff that's going to matter most to you in terms of what we just talked about, is focusing on those big game changer or impactful announcements that could disrupt the industry as a whole. And as we mentioned, there's a lot of them that are out there, but be kind of keep an open ear and open to the idea of possibly adopting to some of these, but not necessarily rush in right away. And hey, it's going to be a hard thing for just about everybody, but just being mindful of those things. Mustapha, any other points that you'd like to make from outside of the ones that I just showcased?
No, I think you really did touch on everything. The important thing is, no matter how active or passive you are in the industry, if it's something that you want to do seriously, you should follow what's going on. So if you can't attend events like this, checking out an article here or there never hurt anybody. And nobody's saying you have to, log all of your time into following everything that's ever happened. But right. Just be aware of it. It's fun, it's exciting, and then it affects us as people in the industry. So
yeah, totally.
I guess that would be my kind of final point.
All right. So that's all we have here today on Any Game Movement. Guys, we really appreciate you listening. And if you have anything else to say, as I mentioned at the very beginning, if you really want us to answer some Q-Box questions, we're leaving that up to you guys. Feel free to ask any type of questions. We will probably be a little bit selective in how we answer them, but we'll do our best to answer all of them. So feel free to reach out at igm@rengenmarketing.com or Mustapha at rengenmarketing.com or Andrew at rengenmarketing.com. And that's pretty much the best way to get in touch with us. Anything else you got for this evening, Mustafa?